Today on the Dolby Institute podcast, we talk with the filmmakers behind Elemental, Pixar's most challenging movie to date, which is playing at a Dolby Cinema near you right now. Joining us are director and co-writer Peter Sohn, as well as the film's director of photography, Jean-Claude Kalache. We discuss Pixar's famously demanding story development process and how this movie evolved over the course of 7 years.
The characters themselves were so impossible, Glenn. Like a character like Ember, who's all fire simulation, and Wade, who we were just trying so many ways to make him feel like water, took so much of the percentage of our time.
We also talk about the unique challenges of animating two lead characters, which are made up entirely of either a glowing iridescent flame or a blob of translucent liquid. And what exactly does a director of photography on an animated film do in the first place? There's a ton of storytelling, filmmaking, and technical insights on today's show. So let's get started. I'm always curious when I sit down and talk with a filmmaker from Pixar. The development process is so long. I'd love to know from you, what was the movie that you actually started out making, and how did it evolve over the course of the development process?
Yeah, these things take a long time, and this film went around in several different versions. But the heart of it was always the same, which helped me a lot because you can get quite lost when you're working on something for that amount of time. And the heart of this has always been about trying to thank the people in our lives that have sacrificed and taken risks for you, and mine were my parents. And the actual act of thanking them was something that I had done as an adult at this sort of ceremony with a lot of people, and it moved me to tears. And so that was sort of the first little ingredient that kicked this whole thing off. And then the other little ingredient was I married someone that wasn't Korean, and that created a whole bunch of crazy culture clash stuff. My grandmother's dying words were like, "Marry Korean," and she passed away, and it had all this pressure on us. And so that brought this other side to it. And then it was in these world of elements, that I used to draw these crazy different characters when I was a kid. But that being said, you could go anywhere with the story, Glenn. I mean, there was a version where, that was just in a written form, where fire came from the magma, and it was about creating a planet. There was a whole larger story. Then there was a version where it was almost like a Godfather story, where it was about these warring family clans, these factions. And then there was a version that were almost like superheroes. Ember was this sort of, rebellious graffiti, elemental graffiti punk that, got into this really dark sort of, xenophobic war with the city, meaning it went so all over the place. But every time I went to these different versions, there were things that you couldn't feel about the relationships. There was things about, the idea of what the parents were going through that you didn't feel. And then this idea of some of these North Stars that I had talked to you about thanking our parents, brought me back and would bring the film back to what it was. But yeah, there were a lot of versions, Glenn. I can't tell you.
What came through really clearly was how personal the story is, and obviously you have a really deep, familial connection to the story as well. So I'm just kind of curious, how does a story that's that intimate and personal survive through this process and then get released by a major studio as a huge summer release?
It has been a crazy. I think it's because of the due diligence of trying to make the story work. All those versions that I told you about was us trying to see could we fit a superhero version of the movie? Could we fit a more, action-packed version of the movie? And it's so funny because the movie kept telling us what it wanted to be. And we were hoping that the personal side of it would remain the heart, but that the film would have rings around it. So it would be this little intimate story between a firewoman and a water guy, but then there would be a larger family story. But yes, to your point, it was still this personal thing. But then there was a city story that they were trying to fix, all trying to fit that within 92 minutes. But it honestly told us, when I did that sort of superhero version, I remember showing the other filmmakers here, and there were so many comments about I don't feel anything. Who's this bad guy? We had this villain named Drip that was trying to take over everything. And I kept getting these comments about what happened to the romance? Everyone just cared about these characters connecting and what was going to happen. And the film really became like it was telling us this thing.
Everything I read about this film refers to it as Pixar's first rom-com, which I think is sort of an interesting way to frame it. So you didn't start making a rom-com; you started with all these different kinds of stories, and then it ended up being, as you say, what it wanted to be.
No, it always had that component of some kind of connection between the two. The first question that I asked is, what if water and fire could connect? What if they could fall in love? What would happen? That was one of the first questions, and so that was always there. It just took a different form. Like there was the romancing the stone sort of version of it. There was like I was telling, like these sort of like Public Enemy versions of it where you're on the run, and but there was always this idea of water and fire connecting through it.
The world is so well realized. And before we get into the design of the look for it, I just wanted to say, like, I love how you crafted the whole culture and even the language of the fire people back in their homeland. So tell me a little bit about the process of filling out that world and creating all those, different worlds that are not in Element City.
Well, that had a lot to do with JC and the art team, meaning there were the characters themselves were so impossible, Glenn. Like a character like Ember, who's all fire simulation, and Wade, who we were just trying so many ways to make him feel like water, took so much of the percentage of our time that, like, once we figured out Ember, it felt like, oh, then we can start worrying about the world and how they would be unified. And I had spent so much time working on the characters that I only had a little bit of work that was really done about the city. In terms of the look of it, I knew exactly all the pieces that I needed to support the story, meaning Ember's fire, what would be the tough for her, what kind of city would be tough for her, and a city with an infrastructure of water started to appear. And then we were doing research in Amsterdam, and that's when JC would show me films and footage from all these movies that would showcase cities like characters, showcase water in different lighting scenarios, and the types of these realities that were. And so it was an in tandem project with JC and everyone as the characters were running that we would now start to utilize this concept of an element city and what it would take to make it,
JC, maybe that's a good chance for you to jump in and tell us a little bit about the influences that you were thinking about and sort of the things that prompted you with the development of the visual look of the film.
Yeah, I would say the first month or two, it was me working on the movie. It was constant conversation with Pete and Don Shank, our production designer. And I took down so many notes because there were so many great ideas, but there were a few constant themes that would pop to the top always. One of them is the yin and yang, the fire versus water. And we kind of held on to this concept and try to see if we can use it in the movie and see how far we can push the contrast, whether it's the city color versus the fire town color, whether it's the water people versus the fire people. We really held on to this. And then initially, Pete had this idea, what if, when I asked about the look, are we going stylized? Are we going cinematic? And he said, what if it was both? Which was really interesting. We've done in the past more cinematic. We've done more stylized. We've never mixed the two. And Pete, I think you came up with this 60-40. So we're like, okay, it's going to be 60% cinematic and 40% stylized. And to be honest, it opened up a lot of great ideas. It was easy the familiar was the cinematic. It was easy to build on that first, but then deconstruct it and add to it ideas that we've never done before. And I would say that was a good, solid year collaboration with our art lighting director, Carlos Leon, and Don Sheck, our production designer, and of course, Pete. So it was the four of us continuously meeting on a weekly basis and just throwing out ideas. At the end of that year, we had over 50 great ideas, and we almost panicked because it was so exciting, but we didn't know where to start. So we had to whittle it down, and we came up with a plan for the movie. We came up with a lighting plan and a camera plan for the movie that Pete saw, approved, tweaked a few things here and there, and we used it throughout the rest.
There, I just wanted to throw in something that I really appreciated that JC had done. We had done this research in New York about layers of history in the city, something that I did some research going to Chinatown with my mom. And there was this really ornate building that was a funeral parlor. I'm like, oh, this is a Chinese funeral parlor. But then in doing the research, like, oh, no, it originally was an Italian bank. And then as the Italians moved out, the Chinese moved in and it became this funeral parlor. And that sort of sense of history was really, interesting to understand migration and cultures moving through a place. And so that was something that, talking to JC about when this family first comes to the city, they move into an earth neighborhood. And like, I didn't have all of the ideas of like, oh, what will the palette be? What will the shapes be? What will all that stuff? And to sort of paint this sort of immaculate reality, meaning a world with a history that we're not really explaining, but trying to support visually, so that you could still have that cinematic experience of like, oh, this is a realized place with details that, connect to some history that I don't know about, but it's enough for me to believe in it, and the way that JC and the team were highlighting this stuff was something that I didn't think was possible, but I didn't think it's possible because we were still so focused on these characters to build. But JC and the team did an incredible job with a smaller group, sort of adding the scope of the history to the city.
I feel like each Pixar film, there's almost a story of each film pushes the technology forward, and each film takes a specific technical problem and solves it. So I'm curious about the technical problem that you had to solve on Elemental, and I have a feeling you're going to tell me it was created by the design of your two main characters. So Tell me about that.
I will let JC talk about the hardest character in our film, but let me start off with Ember. Ember is our main character, and like JC's talking about the 60/40, we had done some experiments with Ember when we turned her fire on for the first time, where she looked like a Balrog from Lord of the Rings. She looked terrifying. She was this very realistic demonic fire. The eyes were set in a very really strange way, and it was really disconcerting. It was just like, oh my gosh, can we even look at a face for this long? It's so static, and it's so busy and tough to look at. But our artists found ways to control fire, control this effect. But it didn't end there. It was just even trying to render the these shots. Someone told me early on, we'll only get 5 close-ups on Ember because of her face was so busy. Just 5 close-ups. And I was like, we can't have a movie with 5 close-ups. This isn't City Lights where we get 1 good close-up at the end of the movie. We really need to balance it out. But then, as hard as that was, we started to find something that unified it started to balance what the real was and the caricature was in that 60/40 thing that Ember became. And then we started moving on to Wade and trying to boil down what would make water without it being actual water. We tried turning on the water like a glass of H2O would just be transparent, and you would see these dentures of his teeth in there, and it was like, okay, how are we going to do this? And then it took a lot of experiments with JC on each of these characters that you were discovering that were freaking us out. JC, please, if you don't mind jumping on that.
Oh, no, I totally agree. The funny thing, Pete, when I started on the movie, my biggest worry was Ember, the main character. And I wasn't even worried about Wade, but as you mentioned, she's a luminous character. So she does her thing, her light. And what was really cool about her colored light, it came straight from animation. So the performance of Ember had color information in it. So for lighting, in a way, Ember was the easiest character we've ever worked with. Wade was the hardest thing we've ever dealt with, period. And on day one, I remember telling Pete, when you look at water, the environment is the light. And Pete is like, what do you mean? I said, the lights show up on the water, but the building show up on the water, and the stuff behind camera everything shows up on the water. So how do you tease all that information out and still make it look like water? And it took a good 8 months. We collaborated with Jacob Kunzel, who was the main shading engineer behind the water. And we would work for a month on a model. We presented Pete, we'll be excited. And he'll say, yeah, it looks like water in a plastic bag. I'm like, all right, we missed it. And we'll come back a month later. He's like, it looks more jelly than what I was anticipating. And the eye is very familiar with water, and there are components of water that your mind expect to see. You expect to see caustics and particulates and maybe ripples and reflections and refraction. And anytime you tweak one of those, if you tweak them a little bit too far, it stops looking like water. And it was a big challenge. So I would say after a good 8 months of back and forth, we came up with something that we were super excited with until animation started animating Wade in that first sequence, and it all fell apart because animation, they're crafting little details, like the eyebrow goes up a tiny centimeter and they want to see that. Well, if you have a dancing highlight next to that eyebrow, now you're not looking at that expression. So water was fighting expression quite a bit. And so it was a moment of panic. And then we spent a month, and we came up with some rules like safety zones for his face where, you can capture the performance without sacrificing the look. And what we found that was really cool is the brain is very forgiving as long as part of the model had water information in it and other part we were not 100% physically correct. Your brain accepts it. So yeah, it took a serious collaboration with animation, a lot of back and forth. I would say that first sequence might have taken a year to perfect, another year to perfect the art of water. And of course, the performance of water helped a lot, like the magic that simulation brought to water, that helped a lot. So there were so many components that helped make Wade look, the way he ended up looking.
That's amazing. And tell me a little bit about the edges of both of these characters, because my first thought was, we're like, okay, well, Wade, so he's just basically he's a clear 3D case that has water in him. But as you just said, that approach didn't work. But he also changes his shape, morphs all the way through. With Ember, does she actually have edges? I'm kind of curious about, from a computational computer standpoint, what are these characters? What are these characters? These 3D characters?
I blame the edges 100% on Pete. That was his idea, but it was a really clever idea. It was bringing the 60-40, the realism versus the stylization, and making them marry together. I think we called it many names. We called it line art. We called it meniscus. What was really cool about it earlier on is we would always start with the ground truth. So we would show Pete, here's what it would look like if it was water. And once you had that base, that foundation look, it was easy for Pete to tease it apart and say, okay, I like the reflection, take out the refraction. I know it's the same color of the skin. What if we could do a complement color, or we push it in a different direction? So I would say visually and from a lighting point of view, it was fairly straightforward. I'll let Pete speak about the implementation of the line art in the face, in the mouth, in the body. That was quite a feat for sure.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most. I think I was really nervous about that aspect. I remember finishing Godino, and one sort of criticism of the film I remember was just like Arlo was so caricatured in a realistic world. And it was always trying to show a little separation of what nature and he was. But when I was on this film, my fear going into this was like, oh my God, we're working with such disparate characters. They could all feel like from different movies, and trying to unify them was a big, priority. And when we were doing fire, all the tests of fire felt like very different looks than where water was, until we found this quote unquote line work that JC's talking about, or the edges, like you're saying. And so one of our artists discovered with a candle, when you find different, exposures of the candle, there's this contrasting color at the edge of a candle that goes like from yellow to a thin blue. And in that contrast created this line work. It looked like an ink line, but it wasn't ink. And but then the same artist, Daniel Munoz Lopez, did a water thing, but using meniscus, like the meniscus of a water. When, when you're in high school and you're looking at test tubes, they're always talking about measuring that meniscus. That skin of the water became the line work for Wade. And all of a sudden they both had this quote unquote line work made of their, different materials, but it started to unify them. And that really started our first sort of ingredient to like, okay, Then we'll talk about features, and then talking about not having a skeleton underneath them and how transparent they are. But it all started with that idea of that line work that you're talking. And, like still as I'm looking at it, there's some, the Ember herself, because she's light, like JC's saying, there were never shadows on her. So anytime we had a dark scene, we couldn't block her out to have us focus on something else, because this whole game is all about trying to lead the eye to something. And then all of a sudden, if you were doing an over the shoulder of Ember on Wade, you're just looking at the left corner where this fire shoulder was, because we couldn't block it out. And so there was new sort of camera work we had to figure out to work around that. And I'm just saying this as every way you turned, trying to unify something, there was something that took you out of it. JC, you said that water. The other thing that I thought you were going to talk about that's so hard was that when he's in a basement, he has a different look. His whole body turns a different color. And then when he's outside in the sunlight, his whole body turned into something else. And he was awful to me. He was so hard.
He was.
It sounds like you made it as hard as possible, because you got your two main characters, one of whom is self-lighting and lights everything that she's in proximity to, and another basically absorbs everything and reflects every environment that he's in. So you made it as hard as you possibly could have on yourself to do this.
Yeah, thank you, Pete.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And it got even more complicated with Wade. Little things like if you put a light from the right side, it shows up on the left. There's a tiny highlight that shows up here, but then I started worrying about how do you communicate that to your team. If you want a light on the left, you say put a light on the right so that it shows up on the left. And little things. And what Pete mentioned was a very big topic. Basically, we quickly realized that Wade is a chameleon. He could take on the color of the environment, and we had a choice: do we stay with the signature color like Ember, or do we honor color and do we let him blend in the environment? And Pete said, let's blend with the environment with that. The problem is when you blend with the environment, you bring complexity. So if there's a red building behind him and a green and a blue, you start putting that detail, he could become really complex. So we devised a method that takes the environment around him and blends it all together into simpler colors and simpler shapes, so that what you get is the feeling of him refracting what's behind him, but it wasn't that accurate. We didn't completely remove everything behind him because water is very tricky and will tell you I no longer look like water, but we had to bring the integration. We even had a 7-step process to integrate Wade in the environment. And whenever our lighters would get it, they would be called Wade certified. They were certified for the integration. And it was, we celebrated those moments because it was a bit tricky to get all these pieces working together. But yeah, we definitely pushed Wade into new frontier in terms of blending him with the environment.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing, well, not unfortunate, the whole trick of the movies that I love is that I don't want the audience thinking about it. I remember seeing Terminator 2 for the first time and being like, how did they do this? And then at a certain point, you're just not even thinking about it anymore. You're just in the movie. And he nods these little details, or Cameron did, about reminding you that this is a man made of metal. Like one of my favorite things that I would talk to JC about is, the T-1000, this liquid metal man, was walking through a set of bars, but his gun that he was holding couldn't move forward. And there was a little clink. And I remember all those details to just tell the audience that this is real. It's not, don't think about the effect, just think about the character. And it was something that we were trying to do in our film a great deal. I think a lot of places successful, but there are other places that I can be critical of. But the joy of the movies is that you're just immersed in it. And as talking about it right now, it was so difficult, but at the same time, it's also to honor the love for movies, that you're not just thinking about holy cow, this took so much work, but it's just, I'm with these characters and what's going to happen next.
Like the best of athletes or musicians, it's incredibly difficult and challenging, but you make it look easy, and right, to the extent that the audience is not consciously aware of this. Right. So that's good on you guys. So JC, we've talked a lot about the development of the characters and the specific challenges around that, but I'd like to take a step back and ask about the role of the director of photography in animation. I think, even a lot of people who are professionals working in the industry are kind of puzzled, like, what does a director of photography on an animated film do? So can you just talk a little bit about kind of what your role is outside of the character animation, but just when you get into the, what does it mean to light and to shoot an animated film, and how does that differ from what we understand that job to be in the live action world?
Yeah, I think they're very similar in principle. I always joke and say that if we're shooting a scene at 4 a.m., I don't have to get up at 1 a.m. because the computer graphic world is frozen, I guess, so to speak. I think we talk the same language. We talk about the color script of the movie. We talk about the color palettes, the color symbolism, the metaphors we use. We plan the value scale of the whole movie, the scenes that are high key, low key, middle key. So in that sense, I think we're very similar. Where we differ is that with computer graphics, you can bend the laws of physics. You can definitely tweak. You can have a sunlight that behaves like a sunlight, but you can also make it do stranger things. And this is where you open up room for creativity. This is where we had that 60-40 blend in our movie. But I think in general, we use the same language. We talk about exposing scenes. We talk about, gaffing scenes, add a cucaloris, add this and that. We barn lights, physical barns, non-physical barns. We talk a lot about the physical versus non-physical controls that we have. If we have a light bulb, we either treat it as a light bulb that is incandescent and 800 lumens, or we treat it as an artistic light bulb and we did that in the fire shop. It's a really cool idea that Pete came up with. He wanted the fire shop to look like a fire shop and a convenience store. So he wanted both. And the best way we were able to solve it is we made the lights in the ceiling start out red and finish blue. And it gave you that mixture. And your brain said, yes, it's a convenience store, but there's something about it that is really warm and red. So I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of overlap between the two. Obviously, we don't have physical equipment. It's all digital equipment. I draw a lot of inspiration from live action. Pete and I looked at hundreds and hundreds of references. And in that sense, I would say we're very, very similar too.
Would you say that this is kind of what makes Pixar, the look of Pixar films, unique and distinctive, is this focus on? And the reason I ask that is because I know Jim Morris very well, who's the president of the studio. We used to work together at Lucasfilm, and he was telling me at one point after he went over to Pixar that he actually organized some trips up to Pixar from some of the great live action cinematographers. I think maybe even Bob Richardson was a cinematographer that came up and taught some master classes at Pixar. And so I'm wondering, was this something that this way of thinking about photographing animation, is that unique to Pixar? And even being so literal about the virtual camera and thinking about lenses and focal lengths and that sort of thing?
I would say so. I think there used to be a Pixar look. I feel now we're so excited that there are many looks, and I used to be comfortable working on a movie. I'm no longer comfortable jumping on a movie because we're reassessing everything, reinventing everything. I think there's the fundamental truth about how we use the lights and how we use the camera that is still inspired by physics and physical equipment. And I like that because there's always a ground truth that you can start with and then present it to the director and see how far you want to tease it apart or not. Like Soul is a good example where half of the movie felt cinematic, but the other half was 100% non-cinematic and stylized and very graphic. So I would say, yes, at the core, we're definitely we still geek out photographs. We bring lenses, we bring real life lenses to the studio. We shoot, we analyze, and then we capture all that information. And then we try to see how to replicate it and then how to break it apart. So a good example would be a bokeh effect. We can take a bokeh and just use it as a physical physically based behavior from the lens, or we can put information in it. We can draw a specific shape. In the movie, the bokeh started out a little bit more round because life was normal for Ember. Eventually, it got a little bit more graphic and heart shaped, and so yeah, I would say definitely inspired by live action, but then we definitely push the envelope beyond that.
We've got a couple of clips that your team has graciously provided us. So the first one is called "Inspect This," and I believe this is Wade when he gets caught in the fire shop, and Ember's father serves up some tasty treats for him. So let's take a look at this clip.
You really food inspector?
As far as you know, yeah.
Then inspect this!
Dad.
That shoots.
Yep, all looks good to me.
No. Inspect with your mouth. Mouth.
You see? He likes it.
I started laughing because, of course, this is such a, it's I don't want to say it's a trope, but it's a familiar thing. Like the father of the, like serving the spicy hot food and testing the suitor for his daughter's hand, which I love how you kind of take this and keep that literal, but raise the stakes by having this water creature having to eat these coals. So tell us a little bit about this scene, and JC, maybe about the challenges of lighting and shooting this one.
Yeah, like early on, I discovered, sometimes when I would take these characters and do something abstract with them, I would lose the audience. And so it hit me like, oh, what if we do something that we all know, but then flip it with the elements? And a big part of this moment was totally exactly what you're talking about. Like, oh, right, this is that classic sort of like guess who's coming to dinner sort of moment. But they're also derived from, like, when I married someone that wasn't Korean. I remember at our sort of pre-wedding dinner, or I don't remember what you call those, but my wife's family side had never had Korean food before, or spicy kimchi, and the way they reacted to all of that I thought was so funny, and we brought it into this moment here. But in that way that we could sort of, exploit the elements. And so some of the science tricks that we were seeing and researching between, when I first started this whole thing, I had an index, or like index cards full of just science effects of like boiling, freezing, magnification, and like, boy, it would be great to try to use all of these ideas in the movie to exploit the elements. But I tried superhero powers, but that got cold. But once I started tying it to character emotions, it started becoming something more, which is what was so fun about this. And, of course, if he ate a hot coal, we could see the coal go through in there. But what would that look like? Would it just be, steam? Would it be boiling? And we were just using half reference and then half the story artist's imagination and the animator's performance to try to come alive. But there's so many details there that we had to juggle to make it even clear that of what was going on. Like JC was saying, this is all virtual. There isn't a body of water where we're throwing any of this stuff in. There is no temperature in this shot. It's all being tricked by color and light and effects, and building up to the, like, we never had that bubble that comes out of his mouth open up before. That happened so late in animation. It was just always the bubble that popped in the screen, but the animator all of a sudden shifted the model for that to happen. And it was all crazy. Yeah, JC, what did you think of that?
Oh yeah, I remember that sequence very well. I think that bubble was an interesting question too, because it was a water bubble inside of a water character. What does that mean? Like, you start with a very basic question, and then it's cool because people would say, well, tweak this, add a color to this, maybe it could be a little bit darker. I'm like, oh, okay, I buy it. We convince ourselves that you can see water inside water, which physically is probably impossible, but it kind of made sense. I think the biggest thing we did with that sequence is to capture Wade's situation. And we did that with color. We made sure that he was the only blue character in that whole sequence. Everything else surrounded him was warm colors, fire shop colors. And that alone puts him in an uncomfortable situation. And it kind of echoes a little bit what Ember felt when she first ran into After Wade and ended up in Element City. She was that one fire character, everything else was blue buildings, cooler palettes around her. We wanted to reverse that and have him be in that moment. I think there was a lot of choreography per shot, like how many bubbles you saw, and there because they were building up the intensity of the cold nuts that he was eating. But it turned out really good, and it was a great collaboration with effects. The effects team, especially the character effects, they brought so many parts to Wade to life that otherwise you would miss. So it was a fantastic collaboration with them for sure.
It was weird shooting the over the shoulders. I think that was one of the sequences, if I remember right, where we did have a little bit more of Ember and Dad's shoulders in the shot looking at Wade because they're so close to each other. But immediately you just kept looking over there. And so if you ever watch it again, you'll notice like, oh, these aren't perfectly paired over, one-on-one shots here, and that they were all cheated to try to get there, but they were cheated because the fire was so damn noisy.
I was going to say that was a worry of Pete from day one. How do you shoot over the shoulder a character that is on fire, or a fiery character, so to speak? And I think the way we ended up solving it, Pete, in some shots, we obviously pushed the character slightly off, but in the color complexity of Ember and the brightness is in the face. And then it ramps back to a darker red in the background. So she still felt like fire, but she did have a bright core in the back of her head. And that helped a little bit with these over-the-shoulder shots.
We had the opportunity to watch the film in our screening room in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, and it was just spectacular. You've got a lot of nighttime scenes in this film as well, and the colors are so beautiful. I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about working with Dolby Vision and what possibilities were unlocked for you as storytellers with Dolby Vision.
Yeah, it was a fantastic experience. It almost feels like a new movie you're watching all of a sudden. I think the contrast alone, and it's kind of sad to know that all the information is there, but we can't access them on our monitors or other media. But there are a couple of things that are very interested in. One of them was Ember as a bright light source. I wanted to see how far we can push her brightness and energy. And the other one is those dark scenes and how far we can go to the darkest dark and still see details and still see colors. And, Dolby Vision is always, it never fails. It makes our movies look magical straight out of the box. With Ember, what was really surprising, initially I wanted to push a lot, and I pushed Ember, and we went to Dolby Studios and we screened it. And we started realizing we're seeing new colors in Ember that were off character that we have never seen before. And it was a big
because red is very different in Dolby Vision.
Exactly. And there was a little bit of panic because it's a character that we spent over a year picking very specific colors. There's over 16 different colors that ramp from one to the other. And at the same time, I wanted to celebrate the energy and the brightness you get from the Dolby Vision. So we ended up splitting the difference. So we definitely got her to a much brighter level than we're used to. But I kind of suppressed down some of the colors that were not in her character. For instance, we started seeing some green in her that were less appealing in her father too. So we did that. With the city, with the contrast, I mean, it's, the image speaks for itself. It's so beautiful to be able to have those extreme brights and dark and yet still appreciate all the details and the dark, the saturation of the dark. And the other really surprising thing is when we saw the 3D stereo version at Dolby too, and that felt phenomenal. That was fantastic. It's this first time that I really fell in love with our stereo version of the movie too. It's just, it was brighter, it was richer, all these things that you lose when you go to a stereo. It felt a non-issue, to be honest, watching it with Dolby Vision.
I agree with you. That's something that actually we don't talk about a lot, but for me, 3D, I've always felt like I was watching a movie with sunglasses on, right? But
yeah.
But 3D and Dolby Vision, actually, you can get bright enough that it compensates for that effect.
Exactly. Yeah.
You guys have been very generous with your time. I know that we're coming to the end of our conversation, but Pete, I can't let you go without asking you about Dolby Atmos and the sound. And I know you got to work with the legendary sound designer Ren Kleiss on the film. So tell me a little bit about designing the sonic environments and how you use Dolby Atmos in the film.
Getting to work with Ren was one of the joys of this whole process. His attention to detail. Look, it boils down to trying to make a great cinematic experience, and the Atmos process is key to the greatest cinematic experience. In that immersiveness, the balance of music and sound effects, and the control that one has with Atmos. I really honestly didn't know the depth of it until working with Ren in those rooms at Skywalker. And then finally hearing it at Dolby at San Francisco, fully realized there was a sadness in me of that, like, once it's out of theaters, that I'll never see it in this way again, in the best possible way. Both Dolby Vision, the concept of dual projectors, and that brightness and the fidelity of the image, it's better than our Pixar's theater here. John Hazelton, if you're hearing me, I'm sorry, but it's true. It really is. But at the same time, Ren created a space where we were always focusing on the emotion and the fun of the world. And so, how best can you explain this to an audience? There's a process where you start doing the sound design only in Atmos, and you get so used to like the richness of like pinpointing a sound to let the audience know, oh, there's water coming from behind you, the left corner. There's so much control that you can have there. But then you have to mix other versions of the sound. I don't know if all the audience knows this, but there's a tremendous amount of work where you're redoing the same sound. But what it is that you're taking pieces or merging pieces from Atmos into the 5.1, into the classic stereo, and the whole every time we took something away, I just kept going like, my God, Dolby Atmos is incredible. That is the cream of the crop. The control that they have overhead, the spatial accuracy is unparalleled, and it was so fun to work with and watch Ren. He had these controls where he goes, okay, here comes the water. It's coming around us. He'd have these little controls to move the sound around the room with us, making us absolutely immersed into the moment. And you're not even thinking about it. You're just, your heart is racing just from these simple details that Ren would control. Dolby Atmos, I'll all the way. I will preach the power of the Atmos plus the Dolby Vision setup. Like we just need, Glenn, we just need more of these theaters everywhere. We just need more of them. That's the whole thing. Because every theater, it's exactly the same experience as what we mixed, which I didn't realize. I didn't realize that every one of these Dolby theaters across the country and around the world have all been set up so that they're not going to pull the audio down. They're not going to dim it down. It will always be as pristine as we saw it. And I'm so grateful for Dolby for that, love for the movies.
Well, Pete, I can't think of a better way to wrap up our interview than with that. We thank you for your love of Dolby, and we're encouraging everybody to go see Elemental at a Dolby Cinema near you. So, Peter, JC, thank you so much for coming on the show today to talk to us about the film. We really enjoyed it, and we wish you great success with it.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It's been an honor.
Many thanks again to Peter and JC for joining us today, and also to our friends at Pixar and Disney who put this interview together for us. You can find Elemental in all of its stunning glory playing at a Dolby Cinema near you right now. If you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, please be sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. This is the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thanks for watching.